Well, thank you all for coming. I'm Carol Lee from Northwestern University, in what I call an A plus in fake retirement, and also the president of the National Academy of Education. And we are delighted every year in AERA. I think you did this last year as well, right? To invite Mark as the executive director of the Institute of Education Sciences to share with this community the ongoing work and sort of projections of IES. So before joining IES, Mark Schneider was a vice president and an institute fellow at American Institutes of Research, AIR, and president of College Measures. Prior to joining AIR, Dr. Schneider served as commissioner of the National Center for Education Statistics from 2005 to 2008. In 2013, the Chronicle of Higher Education selected him as one of the 10 people who had the most impact on higher education policy that year. He is the author of numerous articles and books on education policy. There's something on here about his next book, but I can't read it because it didn't print out well. Other books include Getting to Graduation, edited with Andrew Kelly, published in 2012 by Johns Hopkins University Press, and Higher Education Accountability, edited with Kevin Carey, published by Palgrave in 2010. Charter Schools, Hope or Hype, written with Jack Buckley, was published by Princeton University Press in 2007. Schneider's 2000 book, Choosing Schools, was published by Princeton University Press and won the Policy Study Organization's Aaron Wodowski Best Book Award. Dr. Schneider was a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and distinguished professor emeritus of political science at the State University of New York at Stony Brook. So very impressive history of leadership. So I'm delighted. I've seen you from a distance at IES meetings, so it's great to they got to get you face to face.
I'm going to stand here.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to stand here for a few minutes and do some introductory remarks. Then Carol and I are going to do a back and forth. And then the most important thing is opening up the floor for Q&A. Some of you might have attended the session yesterday that was in honor of Dr. Gordon. And so some of these comments may be familiar to you. So I'll just do them fast. And I don't know how to talk slow, so they'll be fast to that. Even if I intended them to be slow, they would not be slow. So, okay, so bolstering innovation in education research. So I'm going to talk about some of the things that, and you all probably, maybe you don't know, but this is my last year. I've celebrated my 5th anniversary the beginning of this month. It's a 6-year term, so there's 1 year left. The speed at which government works, all the things I'm going to tell you we're going to do, notional probably, government works slow, and some of them actually require action from the Congress, which is even slower than the bureaucracy. So first of all, you probably all know that ESRA, the Education Science Reform Act, is up for reauthorization. So it was passed in 2002. It was part of the No Child Left Behind era. There's a lot of stuff in there that reflects that moment in history. It was supposed to be reauthorized in 2008. It didn't get reauthorized then. Every once in a while, there has been discussion about reauthorizing it. So Bill Cassidy, the senator who's the ranking member in the Health Committee, is committed to trying to reauthorize ESRA as well as other aging laws that are way overdue for reauthorization. There was there's serious discussion in the Senate about reauthorizing ESRA. We've had many discussions with the Hill and within the department. There was a request for information that came out. I think it's closed now. But this is, if you want to talk about bolstering innovation in education, you want to talk about what the future looks like, getting your voice heard with regard to ESRA is still possible, and it's really fundamentally important. So we are working on modernizing some of the terms, some of the conditions in it. We're trying to, we need to reflect open science, for example. We need to put more emphasis on opportunity gaps instead of just achievement gaps, which was, of course, part of what was the moment in 2002 when Ezra was created. So there's a lot of discussion going on with regard to Ezra, and y'all should weigh in to the extent possible at this stage. You could always call me congressman, or your senator. So this is really important, and what happens. So IS is important in our world. It's not that important in the real world, but it's important for us. And again, I think there's a lot of sentiment, especially in the Senate right now, for getting Ezra reauthorized. So again, if the window is open, you should all jump in. The second thing that's happening that it will affect all of us if it's passed is the National Center for Advanced Development in Education, NCAID, and that is embodied in the NEED Act, which has been proposed by Representative Bonamici and Fitzpatrick. It's actually a bipartisan. They sit on opposite sides of the aisle, but it's also bicameral. So we're working on getting Senate sponsors. Bennett is likely to sponsor it. So we're just trying to figure out how to do that. So in the if you don't know about the NEED Act and NCAID, we've been talking about ARPA Ed for, well, when I was at NCS in 2005, we started having meetings with DARPA, the original ARPA, and we met with them several times. There were efforts actually to try to get something like ARPA Ed established. The Bush administration ran out, nothing happened. And then under the Obama administration, ARPA came back. There were a lot of discussions about it, but ultimately nothing happened. I guess the closest thing we ever got to an ARPA-like thing in Ed was I3 and then EIR. And a lot of that was driven by Jim Shelton. But at the end of the Obama administration, it hadn't happened. I spent a couple of years under the Trump administration and now 3 years under the Biden administration. Nothing much happened with regard to ARPA Ed or NCAID under Trump. And the effort has picked up very strongly in this current administration. If we get it, and legislation, who knows? If we get it, there will be a whole new center, the National Center for Advanced Development and Education. And the legislation, if we get it, if it's established as a new center in IS, will be legislatively dedicated to high risk, high reward, rapid turnaround activities. Absent that, we got $30 million in the omnibus to engage in ARPA-like activities. There's $45 million in the president's proposed budget. That would bring us up to $75 million as an annual appropriation. Without a center to run it. So what we're doing is at least in the short term, we're creating an innovation team in NCER, the National Center for Education Research. Liz Albro is here. She's the commissioner of NCER. So we're creating a innovation team within NCER. And the goal is to try to, within the small budget, $30 million for real people is a lot of money. In federal land, it's not that much money. But we're trying to figure out how we can, in fact, start down the path for ARPA Ed and NCAID-like activities. So we have to hire people to do that. Again, any of you work for the government, that's not the easiest thing to do. So we're bringing in some fellows. We're bringing in at least one technical person to help set up the machinery, and then ultimately we will probably hire as many this year if we can, as many as 3 program managers. And if you know anything about DARPA or ARPA-like activities, ARPA-E is the other big one. The program managers are critically important. So we have program officers at the current time in NCR. They're great. They do. If you've ever had money from us, you know that they're really, really, really good. But the job of a program manager is different than the job of a program officer. Program managers are much more aggressive. And so my job description, which of course is not a government job description, is you have to be slightly crazy to believe you could do something that's almost impossible. You can't be totally crazy. That's my job. But you could be slightly crazy, and you have to believe that in 3 to 5 years, you could accomplish something that's probably not going to work, but that you have to be committed. You have to have a vision, and you have to have, the energy, the commitment to pursue that vision and to pursue that product. There'll be a lot of emphasis on commercialization, scaling up, because DARPA is very heavy into products, which is not something that we do very much. So ARPA E, the energy, totally into products. And so we need to, so there's a shift. There's actually a mind shift. So I went to the ARPA E summit in Washington, D.C. Earlier this month, and I was struck by a quote that I heard a long time ago from James March. Some of you may remember him, one of the great organizational psychologists, theorist of the last 100 years, I would say. And he said, God must have loved the physicists because he gave them all the easy problems. And I'm thinking, so I actually thought it was Feynman that said it, because that's something that you could imagine Feynman saying, but in fact, it was James March. And I'm sitting there looking at the amazing stuff that ARPA-E is doing, and it's all about batteries, hydrogen, the hydrogen economy, but it's all physical and chemical. There's no humans involved in this. So as soon as you get into our world where there's just humans, right? Our world is so much more complicated. So when I was a university faculty member, like all of you sign these beautiful models and you go out and test them, and humans always screwed it up, right? So our task, again, God gave all the easy problems to physicists, left all the hard ones to us. So NCAID is going to be the home. In the meantime, the transformation unit is going to be the home for all kinds of work that some of you know. For the last several years, we've been pushing, on new kinds of models, new kinds of grant programs. So one of the things that we're going to start, I think the first thing out of the gate are going to be seedlings. And this is ARPA-E does this all the time. There's several ARPAs floating around. They all do these seedlings. We may do like 10 or a dozen, $250,000 9-month grants. Come back for a second round. And this model, I don't know if any of you know about our SBIR program, the Small Business Innovation Research Program. I love that program. It's great. Some of our greatest successes come out of that. It's small change, compared to some of our other stuff. So the SBIR has the exact same 2 rounds, an innovation round number 1, innovation round number 2. You get a couple $100,000 in round 1. You come back and say, here's the prototype. We told you we're going to build this prototype. We built it. Take a look at it. Give me another $900,000 in round 2. And right now, SBIR stops at round 2. But one of the most interesting things that ARPA-E does is a third round called Scale Up. And again, you could just Google it. And that is a bigger investment to scaling up things and bring it to market. So again, we don't think that way. We don't think that way. And most academics who get most of the money that we give out, it's not in their mindset. But we are going to do a third round be Scale Up round 1. Seedlings round 1. I guess small trees round 2, and then commercialization in round 3. So whether or not either ESRA gets reauthorized or the NEED Act gets passed, I have no idea. But in the meantime, we do have money, right? As you know, authorizations and appropriations don't necessarily go hand in hand. So we're going to try to launch in the innovation team. We're going to try to do these seedlings. We're going to move the transformative research RFA into that, and we don't know what other stuff will be moved into it or what stuff will be created. So those 2 are legislative. Hopefully they'll happen. Any help y'all could give, we much appreciate it. So let me just talk about a couple of other things that are on the horizon. AI. So so everybody talks about AI. I mean, if you listen to any of the news channels, if you read any news organizations, any magazines, what's happening with AI is, like, oh, we're going to design AI to create. I heard this on the Ezra Klein show the other morning. We're gonna do AI, and we're going to empower AI to create paper clips. And it's going to be, I mean, yeah, obviously a trivial example, but the story there is clear. So we created this AI to do paper clips, and all the machine cares about is paper clips and producing paper clips, and then starts eating the world in the pursuit of more and more paper clips, right? And there are all these apocalyptic visions of AI outcompeting us. And the other, it wasn't on the show, but it was someplace else. A bunch of Neanderthals are sitting around a circle. They're the biggest humanoid race, and they see some Homo sapiens walking around. They think this skinny people with no hair, they're ugly, right? So, but they have some cool tools. Let's invite them to the fire and figure out how we could use them, right? So it turns out that the thing that drives our success over Neanderthals was that we have bigger brains and more intelligence. So the other horror, is we're going to create a artificial intelligence that's smarter than we are, and just like we displace all the Neanderthals, this new AI is just going to displace us because it'll be smarter than we are. So, on the other hand, of course, there's AI is all over the place now, and we haven't hit the apocalypse yet, and maybe we'll never get there, or maybe we will. But the fact of the matter is that we need to deal with AI. So, the ramifications of this in schools, in education, in the way our kids are going to be raised, the world that they're going to face is beyond, you need AI to understand it, because my small brain can't grasp all the things that are happening. So for me, one of the most interesting challenges is we have spent tons and tons and tons of money on literacy, right? Early literacy, high school doesn't, reading. And like, what does that mean anymore? Right? What does it mean? What does literacy mean in the era of ChatGPT? And you can see all these stories showing up all over the place about how teachers are using ChatGPT for one thing or the other. Students are actually teachers ahead of students, believe it or not, in terms of their use of it. But what does literacy mean? What are literacy skills? Right? What do they mean where you have ChatGPT? And I struggle with this. We all struggle with it. We heard some examples in a recent meeting where a professor said, "I don't let my students submit anything to me directly without going through ChatGPT." And why? Because most of you university faculty, you know that one of the horrors, one of the hardest things, I'll put it that way, that we do is we grade student papers, right? I mean, it's extremely time consuming because the writing often is not very good. Even with spell checks, you still find spelling checks errors. So if you submit papers into ChatGPT, and theoretically you've gotten all the facts right, so one of the biggest problems with ChatGPT is it just makes stuff up. But if you submit your own papers into ChatGPT, it comes back much more articulate. It comes back shorter, more concise than it went in. One of my friends who works with the Inter-American Development Bank, he's perfectly fluent in English and Spanish. He says, when I write in Spanish, I have a problem. So that, as we all know, it's like the last fluency skill that you generate when you're learning, that you accomplish when you're learning a new language. He puts all his papers through ChatGPT, and his command is like, make this better. And it comes back, and again, the facts, he supplied all the facts, all the references. It comes back, and he says it's so much tighter and so much better. So we need to figure out what is literacy in a world of ChatGPT, right? And I think the horizon is vast, right? And I think that we're going to just see an amazing change, but we need to control that change, and we need to understand it. So we have partnered with NSF to do at least two. Right now, we've done 2 AI institutes with them. The first one that was announced earlier this month, April, I think it's early April, was the one on speech and language pathologies. And And for me, and I'm sorry, I know I said this yesterday, I said this probably a dozen times in many different forums. I've written about it. For me, this is like I'm so happy this was the first one out of the gate. I'm so happy because this is what the story was. There's a persistent gap. Students have speech and language acquisition problems, many students, and we don't have anywhere enough speech pathologists, right? So we end up with students that this is probably well, okay. I mean, they get drive-by assessments, right? Quick assessments because there's not enough time to do real assessments, real depth assessments. And then then there are diagnoses, and then there are treatment plans. Again, we don't have enough pathologists to do the work. And one of the other things that happens when we have ELL and when we have special education students, we take these scarce teachers and we ask them to do IEPs, or we ask them to do this other thing, this other thing, this other thing. And 50% of their time is spent on filling out paperwork. Crazy. So this NSF AI Institute for Speech and Language Pathologies is doing universal screening using AI, universal diagnosis and treatment plans, and ChatGPT to do EIPs and other paperwork. So here are the distinguishing characteristics of this. A persistent gap, harnessing AI to take care of things that teachers and pathologists don't have enough time to do, right? So we're harnessing technology to create, and so this is human-centered design. We keep talking about this, but think about this. What we're doing is we're designing systems using AI to free up scarce teaching resources to work more closely directly with students. Right? If you can tell me a better example of what we should be doing, tell me. Right? But for me, this is the model of where we should be going. And we're going to do this. We're doing a STEM institute with NSF that'll be released later this month, next week, I think. And I hope we can do others like this. So the interesting question is like, okay, we want to be careful about over-medicalizing special education needs, but the fact of the matter is this is a problem that we could emulate what doctors have done for decades already, right? So dyslexia is a very common, very difficult condition to diagnose and to treat. Why can't we figure out better screenings? Why can't we figure out better treatment plans, right? So this is, for me, this is a model that we need to, what we need to think about and how to tap AI. But again, for me, it's all about individualized instruction, individualized care, right? So individualization. So yesterday, if you were in the panel, Nayela was talking about the factory model of schools. We all talk about this, right? And it was created 100 years ago or more now, and it was the assembly line. Well, kids are not Model Ts, right? So we need to figure out much more about how to individualize instruction. And I think what I hope is that AI could help us get there. And again, the other thing is human-centered. So again, so this AI, tapping this AI, and look, it's an experiment. So we've given them SUNY Buffalo 3 years and $20 million. We'll know whether or not this works or not soon enough. Okay, so that's clearly something on the horizon. So the second thing that's on the horizon that we'll be working on is big data. And actually, I don't know if any of you know Amy O'Hara at Georgetown University. So she's beyond big data. She has the massive data institute. So big data was like, that was like last year, right? Now we're talking about massive data. So what are we going to do about massive? Maybe we're just not into massive yet. Maybe we're just into big data. So what do we need to do with this? So clearly we need to figure out how to use it, right? We need to figure out how to harness it for the kinds of things, actually almost for the same kind of things I just talked about. Individualized instruction, human-centered design. So we're going to announce next month, the early part of May, the result of an X Prize that we ran. Very successful competition. It was a digital learning platform, X Prize. And we'll be announcing the winner in a couple of weeks. But we've also run two other prizes that weren't as successful. We did a middle school science prize, and these are like $1 million prizes. Um, and, science education in the United States is, shall we say, not as good as it should be. All we need to do is look at the NAEP results for science. Oh, by the way, math. Oh, by the way, reading. We know that the country's not doing such a good job. But science is critical because we want a large, diverse STEM workforce. Well, if you're below basic in science, and by the way, you're below basic in math, the chance of you going into a high-paying, needed STEM career is pretty small. So we thought we would run a science competition, a science prize, and we had to cancel it because we didn't get enough people to show up. We're running a prize for upper elementary school math for students with disabilities, and that was a squeaker. We think, we hope that we have high enough applicants, and we've launched the competition, and they have a year to get this, to have proven results. But it was hard. It was hard to even get enough applicants to say that we hit a minimum threshold. In the meantime, John Whitmer is back there. So John's a fellow with IAS. He's a data scientist, and he's running, I don't know, half a dozen prizes now. About 2 dozen or just two? Two. Yeah, but we're running two, but we have many either done or in the pipeline. Okay, and we don't have any problems getting applicants. So the reason that we don't have any problems getting applicants is because it's based on big data, NAEP data. So NAEP has collected hundreds of thousands of math and student artifacts, math answers, something like 100,000 writing samples. We're doing a civics. We're trying to work on a civics one, which is much smaller in number, but critically important given what, the condition of civic discourse in the United States at the current time. And the prizes are not $1 million. The prizes are $50,000, $10,000. It almost doesn't matter what the dollar figure is, because what the teams want is access to the data. And why is access to data critically important for us as well as for them? Because they have models that they need to test in big data and they can't get it, right? They can't get it. So NAEP has that data. We have to make sure that that data gets into the public domain and is used. So it's big data that is one of the most critical resources. If we don't get education, big data out there, we know that ChatGPT is just going to scrape around and find stuff, and it's never going to get better for our purposes without using big data and NAEP is one of the biggest data sources that we have. The second biggest data set that we have is the state longitudinal data system data. So if we get the NEED Act, SLDS V2 is in the NEED Act and is actually in ESRA also. And that would be rebuilding a system that cost us $1 billion since 2005. And the last amount of money, big money, was spent in 2010 and 11. So that's 13 years ago. So SLDS is an old, so this is a state system. So there are many states that have actually created, maintained, and upgraded their systems. But the fact of the matter is there are many systems that were built using actually probably 1900 architecture since we started in 2005. But it's old architecture, and it's just like, that's not the world we live in. So SLDS V2 is going to be a modern architecture. It's going to emphasize interoperability so that states and LEAs can exchange data more easily and more quickly. It's going to emphasize interoperability between states so that state consortium could work together, creating better data. And one of the things that's critically important is that it's going to be a backbone for the integration of other data systems, other data into SLDS. So we could get social justice, we could get social food insecurity, we can get criminal justice, we can get all kinds of other data systems merged into the state longitudinal data system. So with big data, with massive data comes big problems. Privacy, right? So we need to engage in a much more nuanced, sophisticated discussion about privacy in an era of massive data. So there are, and look, I mean, I care passionately about privacy. When we were running Matt Solder and I were running college measures, we would work with states. They would give us data, and I would say, please make sure it's scrubbed of any identifications, right? And my line was, the only social security number I ever want to see in my entire life is my own, right? And sometimes I made mistakes and gave us stuff that, like, oh my God, get rid of this, right? It was a little scary, but any discussion of privacy has to be in the context of benefit cost analysis. Well, just think if we had a data system, SLDS data system, that had data from different social welfare organizations besides education. What happens if we build an SLDS that has labor force outcomes, has pre-K? Well, we could get a much better, much more sophisticated view of what's going on with our kids. So that's a major benefit. So there is a risk in privacy, but we have to have a discussion that balances the benefits and the costs. It's just not only the risks. There are benefits that we have to take into consideration when we're talking about those risks. On top of that, and again, Amy O'Hara at the Massive Data Institute, AIRDEF, the Advanced Education Research Development Fund, has worked on something called data safes. There are all kinds of technologies that are coming out that are modern, that don't eliminate, because it's impossible to eliminate the possibility of data leaks, but minimize those so that we can more confidently start merging large data together so that we can actually use modern analytic techniques. And one of the goals in SLDS v2 is to make sure that those data don't sit in, a closet someplace, a very big closet. Well, actually, it's big, so it doesn't have to be a big closet. They're not sitting someplace, over there, and that we have to figure out how to get that data back into the hands of communities and teachers and students and schools so that it's usable. But we can do that, but there's a lot of work that has to be done. Just a couple more things, two more things. So we need to work on broadening participation. So that's one of the themes of this meeting. And you just walk around and you know that this is a serious discussion about how to broaden participation. And for us, this means, in different kinds of investments. For example, we need to encourage the partnerships between R1 universities and MSIs. R1's, look, we're a science agency, and almost every science agency has the same pattern. The same 10 universities get all the money, almost all the money, the same research institutes, AIR, RTI, SRI. They're the ones. So almost all the money goes to, a relatively small number of rainmakers, right? And we're not alone in that. That's one of the things, the way the science has been built. But we need to figure out a different model. We have to figure out how we can still make scientific advances, even faster scientific advances than the rate at which we're doing, but we also have to figure out how to broaden participation. And that to me is a challenge. We're doing things. We have pathway programs. We encourage development grants for young scholars. We encourage the partnerships that I talked about. But this is a serious challenge that we have to undertake in an increasingly diverse world. We just have to do this, and we will do this. We will do it as fast as we can, but probably a lot of people don't think it's fast enough, but we're working on it. So the last thing, which was what we ended with in the session yesterday, was about assessments. So what do we use assessments for? So it's mostly about accountability, right? But assessments should be much more than that. So we need to start thinking about what a modern assessment system would look like. So technologically, I think we pretty much know some of the things that would go into it, right, into a good assessment system. So we need auto scoring. That's just a way of minimizing the human touch in this thing, makes it faster and cheaper, which is essential. One of the more interesting discussions that I've seen recently is using ChatGPT for auto generation of items. We don't talk about questions in assessment. We talk about items. I never understood why we do this, but anyway. So how do we use ChatGPT for item generation? So Complicated items are extremely difficult and extremely costly. And what we do now is we lock a couple of hundred teachers, usually teachers, in a room and say, go write some questions. Well, that's so backwards, right? We can't eliminate humans. We should not even think about it. But ChatGPT could produce the same 500 items that 100, 200 teachers locked in a room do, and take 6 weeks, and they could do it in 10 minutes. Then you give those items to the teachers to validate. So it's humans in the loop, but ChatGPT is generating the item after item after item after item after item. Humans say that's good, that doesn't work. Yeah, not so sure about this. But we need to. We could speed up assessments. We could have more complicated assessments, cheaper to do ChatGPT, and then of course we need to think about how to do adaptive testing. If we do all these things, we could reduce the cost of assessment. We could will improve assessments, but we have to think about what we want the assessments to do, right? So we don't want assessments to identify kids that are falling behind and throw them away. We need to do the same thing that we started with when we talking about AI. Individualized scoring, right? This is why adaptive testing is so important, and feedback, so that we can identify which students are lagging in which areas. A good assessment system will do that for us. But again, it requires both technology and human thinking to do this. So I'm going to stop there. I think I talked slowly enough, but I took more time than I intended. Okay, thank you. So I could do.
So, President Biden has announced the appointment of members of the National Board for Education Sciences, and I was honored to be among the appointees.
Did you do your ethics clearance?
Yeah, they did the finance thing and the money and all that. I don't have any, so it wasn't a problem. But this panel, as I understand it, has not met since 2016. So when do you anticipate the first meeting to occur?
Okay, so not surprisingly, it's complicated. So right now, as you know, it's a presidential appointment. It used to be presidential appointment and Senate confirmation, right? Which meant that it was almost impossible to get anybody on. I'm glad you did your finance form, because of the 14 people that nominated. There's still several that haven't done it. It's like going to a very intrusive doctor. I won't mention my body part, but it sort of feels like that. I mean, I have to do this all the time, and it's really awful. So we're waiting for the last few people to be to go through their ethics clearing, the financial clearances, and then we will have a meeting.
Okay, this is something that we call.
Well, I can't. So I'm under instructions not to call the board until the last two people are. So we're I mean, I can't make people
I
submit the forms that if they don't want to submit it.
Yeah, just keep people there. So you in a point of whatever. I don't know when the meeting.
No, we will have the first meeting. Will probably, again, not under my control, but we will have a virtual meeting first, and then it's supposed to meet 3 times a year. But don't worry about it. You get a nice trip to Washington, D.C. And we'll try not to do it in the summertime, where Washington, D.C. is not a fun place to be.
Well, it's not a problem. I have grandkids in Richmond, so I'm point.
So then you got a free trip to visit.
Right. Last year, the National Academies released 3 reports on the future work of IES. One of these reports concerned the research centers NCER and NCSER. And at an AERA 22 session to discuss the recommendations of that report, an audience member asked you what would be the first step you would take to implement the recommendations of the report. And you said a review of IES training programs. So just wanted to get a sense of where that is and how that's unfolding and what you're finding.
Okay, so we are committed to doing the training programs. Mm-hmm. So one of the nice things about being up here and having Liz in the audience is that ultimately I'm going to ask her to answer this. because because she actually knows things. I just make things up, right? And I just talk blah 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 blah, and then Liz takes notes and then tries to figure out like what did he say? What did he really want? And she's nodding because she knows this is not an easy thing. So I'm going to punt on this one because I could tell you what I think is right, but she could tell you what's really happening. So I don't know if you want to take the time out now or you want to come back later to that.
Yes.
Oops,
Tripping over things. Is this on?
it's on.
Okay, awesome. So the short answer is we awarded a small contract to try to figure out what the metrics were, because one of the things that we were charged with through the NASM report is to try to get an understanding of who's participating in our programs and what has their success and what have their success and failures been. So the first step was to think about the whole body of training work that we are supporting, from undergraduate pathways all the way up through methods training programs for folks like yourselves, and try to come up with a set of metrics. That contract is just about to end, and it is our intention to launch, sort of hopefully have another contract to do the work of trying to gather data of the more than 2,200 individuals that we've supported and figure out what they are doing and what the successes have been and where we're not actually making progress or we want to make progress. That is where we are, and we will share out as we have things that we can share, and we're excited to do it. So, I think that's all, Carol. Did you have a follow-up? Okay, talk to Mark because he's the one up there, not me.
Don't sit so far in. Sit at the edge over here because I'm pretty sure there'll be some other things like, oh, I don't know, Liz, what do you know?
What are you anticipating, Liz, though,
Hey, you want to come on up?
in terms of the process of disseminating these findings? How are you thinking about doing that?
I told you not to get.
I know it was a good thing because I would trip and then it would be really embarrassing. So we will. The deliverables at this stage are not public because they're internal for our deliberations. But for those of you who know, Mark has letters from the director. I try to write letters from the commissioner. So that will certainly be the first look into that. And then the hope is that we will have public reports and public facing things that everybody can see and learn from and provide input on in terms of what are the metrics we're missing. What are the things that you wish we were answering questions about that we're not? But the NASM report gave us lots of ideas about what people are asking. And so we're hoping we will have public facing reports that everybody can learn from. So that's the goal.
Okay, thank you. Back to Mark. That same National Academies report recommended greater transparency at IES on the individual and institutional backgrounds of who applies, who gets funded, who serves on review panels, and who gets access to training opportunities. So has IES made progress on this challenge?
So part of the problem is the data that's necessary to answer those questions. So we cannot require a lot of information that the Academy has recommended that we do. We do voluntary data collections. The question is whether or not we could start making them more mandatory. And our response rate, like for most surveys, is not so good. So we do have some information. And we're trying to get better information. But again, we are, as a government agency, we're constrained about what kinds of questions we could ask. The other thing, the peer review issue is actually very interesting. So here's a challenge, right? How many of you have served on our peer reviews? Okay. And to do that, you had to go and fill out an intake form, right? I can't find that intake form, right? That intake form is like 8 layers deep and you need some secret keywords to find it. So that alone is a major improvement, which I don't know why it was ever buried so deep, because this is one of the most important things that we need to do. We need to get more different people into the peer review system. And if you can't find the form, well, maybe it's a test. If you can't find that form, maybe you're not good enough to be on the peer review system. But it's a crazy thing to have something that's so fundamentally important, not like click on this button. You want to be a peer reviewer, click here and to start the process. So that we're working on that. But until we get a different, broader set of reviewers, then there's an incredibly conservative bias in what happens in the peer review process. So the board has to approve any changes in the peer review system. We have some ideas about what to do when we get seated. One of the things that we will be talking about is different peer review processes, because the model is venerable, right? It's what NIH does, we do. NSF has a slightly different variance on this. ARPAs have a totally different way of going about peer review, which we will take to the board because it will require some major steps and changes, which the board needs to approve. So that's number one. Number two, it turns out that to change the composition of peer review panels to include other voices than academics or research centers, research contract shops like RTI, is extremely difficult. And the reason, and we tried really hard to bring in entrepreneurs, state policymakers, local policymakers, just have different perspectives and different eyes on the process. So after working at College Measures for 10 years, I knew many people, really qualified, incredibly smart people who were working in state agencies and local agencies, education agencies. Hey, could you come and spend 3 days in the middle of January in Washington, D.C., evaluating our proposals for us? Join the peer review system. The state legislature's in session. I have to be on call 24/7. I would love to do it, but I can't. One after the other, after the other, after the other. The entrepreneurs come, have a different perspective, but they go into these, again, about half the people in this room have been on peer reviews, and we talk in our own language. Which some of you know that I've been pushing for plain language. The whole federal government has been pushing for plain language for a long time, but we use jargon all the time. So one of my best friends, a really smart entrepreneur, is on the panel. He calls me back. He says, I didn't understand what people were talking about, right? And they were talking in, it's their world, not my world. So we have these kinds of problems, right? And to the extent to which our peer review system stays the way it is, it's always going to be conservative, a very conservative system. So we need to try to figure out how to broaden the peer review system, in some way simplify it. But these are not only IS problems; these are problems in all sciences.
So I'm curious, in terms of the data set, I presume that you already have mainly the form that people fill out in terms of serving on a peer review. Is this a technical problem in terms of accessing that data, or?
You mean why we don't publish it? It's all private.
No, not about publishing anything individual. Just if I'm understanding correctly. I've been on several panels, and one of the things that always struck me the first time you go into this big room and everybody's there for the breakfast or whatever to eat. And just on the issue like race and ethnicity, typically I could count on one hand how many people of color I see. So I'm assuming the data is somewhere. And the question is whether, because it's not individual data, you're just aggregating to see what trends are, whether or not, is this a technical problem of where that data is in terms of making it accessible for your analysis?
So, again, I would be lost without it.
So Carol, it's a super good question. It's something we've been struggling with. I think there are three things that we've been thinking about. So does the data have answers to the questions that we want, right? So the NASM charged us with collecting information about disciplinary background. Yeah. Turns out that doesn't live anywhere other than in people's CVs. And even from people's CVs, that's really hard to extract. And those are in flat PDF files. And there are thousands of them. And my team is 17. And Anne's team, the peer review is like 5, right? And so part of what we're trying to figure out is how to extract data or how to collect data that we don't have. The second piece of this is that when we collect personally identifiable information, including information about disability status, about race, ethnicity, there's an assumption of privacy. And what happens is that the numbers, there are categories of individuals that are small enough that we actually can't share that information because of privacy risk, right, and disclosure risk. So we are trying to figure out how to balance the need to share with the public what we're doing and who the folks are that we're serving with the need to maintain privacy as we're required to do by law. So we are trying to figure that out on the back end and are looking really hard at the data. And so that's where we're at. But we are in the midst of doing it. I know Anna's trying to figure out what to do with the peer review data that she does have. And Mark talked about different response rate challenges. So as you all know, all of the forms say do not wish to disclose, and a large percentage of folks don't wish to disclose. So that causes some challenges.
So I'm wondering, and this would be really to both of you too, whether or not if people
Just stand there.
actually could just bring one of those chairs up.
I offered her earlier. It's getting a little late for that.
But whether or not you have given any thought to sort of systemic ways of establishing relationships with diverse kinds of stakeholders, just what you were talking about in terms of reaching out to policymakers or entrepreneurs, the extent to which that might be individual reach out versus are there collectives, collaboratives of some sort that could be that you could establish relationships with in terms of being able to reach out and diversify their recruitment process.
So I think it was last year that we talked to Nyla in depth about how we could coordinate her outreach efforts with ours. And we really intended to do this. And I mean, Liz said there's 17 people and we managed, I mean, we just gave out $100 million worth of grants. They all have to be managed, right? So the staff is small staffing has always been a problem and it's limited on a lot of activities that you're talking about. We really, so we've been in touch with her on and off, trying to figure out how best to coordinate it. And it's just, we just don't have enough people to do the kind of work that's necessary. So we are trying, within the boundaries of what we can do and what our staff support to, for example, we're encouraging, in some cases, demanding that R1s partner with MSIs. Right. So, I mean, the problem. I mean, we've been enough of MSIs and HBCUs to know that they don't have the infrastructure necessary to apply for our grants. Right. And this is a serious problem. And R1s have the infrastructure, but we want to go beyond R1s. So one of the things we're doing is not requiring, in some cases requiring, but in other cases encouraging partnerships between HBCUs, MSIs, and R1s. But how hard could you push this? How hard can you make this happen? So we're pushing on that. We're doing training programs. The Pathways program that Liz just mentioned, I think, is one of the most successful things that we do. But you've been involved in this, right? I mean, the students drop off all along the way, right? I mean, it doesn't matter what the race, ethnicity, gender is. The success rate, the throughput is, we just lose people. So we need more people in. We need to. Some of them are, the older cohorts are actually many of them are in the professoriate already. So that's a very successful program.
So just a last comment and then move on to the next question. But part of what I was thinking of in terms of the notion of sort of institutional kinds of collaborations that can support the work that you're doing and the aims that you have. So I know, for example, in AERA or a National Academy of Education, Spencer Postdoc, this has been an ongoing challenge in terms of trying to diversify just the recruitment of people who apply, even for fellowships. And so some of the things that we've done on some other projects with the National Academy, for example, we're working out relationship with the Council of Great City Schools that has a representation from the leadership of 80 of the largest school districts, in the country. In AERA, the variety of special interest groups and divisions have outreach to a wide range of people, institutions, and the like. Ways in which some of these kinds of even in terms of practitioners, the National Council of Teachers of English, National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, some gathering, for example, where you might just bring together leadership from these organizations that already have the outreach that you're seeking, where there might be some way of sort of collaborating and aiming each other. So just planting a seed.
We'll work with the Council of Great City Schools all the time. Great.
The federal budget passed in December 2022 included an additional $40 million for IES to invest in, quote, quick turnaround, high reward, scalable solutions intended to improve education outcomes for all students. How are you planning to allocate these funds, and will there be a new competition or set of competition?
So so that's we handled that. So so the 40 million, 10 million went to the school pulse, and I hope you all know about the school pulse. So this was so after many years of not systematic, less than systematic, I'll put it that way, attempts to do fast sensing of what's going on in schools, we launched the school pulse. So the school pulse for months, sorry, not years, because it's only a year and a half old, was originally answering a question about what schools are open, what schools are closed, the modes of instruction, and it was one of the most valuable sources of doing it. And of course, given the rapidly changing environment, that had to be fast. So it's monthly. It started with a NAEP sample, and now it's a nationally representative sample. It's monthly. We go from field to publication, usually within 3 weeks. And especially for NCS, but for IES in general, a rapid turnaround like that is unheard of. But the fact of the matter is the kinds of data that the school pulse is picking up and reporting is stuff that if it's a year old, it's worthless. So this is one of our first efforts to put sensors out in the environment to capture rapidly changing environments. So it's not the level it's not the level of accuracy, or it's not at the fifth decimal point, but it's fast, it's accurate, not to the fifth decimal point, but nobody needs the fifth decimal point for almost all the work we do, and certainly for work that is measuring rapid changes in schools. So I think the school pulse, so 10 million went to the school pulse, really important innovation, and we're continuing that. The other 30 million went into the include, the rapid turnaround. So remember, the interesting thing about the budget is said high reward. They forgot to say the high risk part.
The budget also included explanatory notes from Congress to IES directing you to provide, quote, implementation plans and associated timelines for the recommendations of all 3 National Academy reports. So when do you expect to respond to that directive?
So we have filed all the answers with the Congress. And so they're very detailed. They're very detailed plans with regard to it's every year we have to put an operational plan in place with regard to the budget cycle. So we filed all of those. So Liz has done a lot of work on the research one. There's no reason we can't publish that, is there?
It's a good question. So I think that we can publish some of it. So we have an appendix, and it's Helen, Matt, and you and I it's like, 10 pages worth of stuff that we've been doing related to the future of education research. And I think we have to figure out what the sensitivities are. So we can't like show up the hill. Like that's like not good practice. So this has gone to the hill, and it just went earlier this week. So I will get back and figure out, we've been wanting to share, but we've been advised to wait until we shared it with Congress before we share it publicly. So I'm assuming that once it's with the Hill, we'll be able to turn it into a format we can share it out with everybody so people can see.
Right. So, so you don't want to scoop the Hill, right?
But are there any sort of high-level takeaways that you have about one of the challenges of doing this, besides the procedural issues here? What you think have been the challenges?
We told you, we invited you up here before.
It's okay. It's good for me to stand, right? There's a lot of sitting at conferences. I think the challenges, so there's people challenges, like that's the big piece, right? A lot of what was asked it really involves investments in people, and we're building and growing. And so that's really great in terms of internal to our staff. Funding to do a lot of the work that we're doing. I think the other piece that's been very interesting with the future of education research is that while it was initially written directly, it was for NCR and Mixer, but as we're working through it, we're realizing that it has implications across NCEE NCER and NCSER. And so we're trying to be really intentional as we think about how do we take the recommendations and apply them across the investments that we're doing. That's not answering your question, but that's kind of where I'm at in terms of that. But the training stuff is, I think, the best example because we put that out there. I guess the only other thing I would say is that we also did a small landscape analysis contract to understand how our counterparts across federal agencies are addressing broadening participation. And we're trying to learn from them in terms of what are they doing that we can do, given the fact that we have limited resources and small numbers of people in terms of strategies that would make sense.
But the point, I think everybody knows that I'm much more in, maybe to my detriment in cases, and I'm very strongly in favor of transparency and publication of information. So these operating plans, including the responses to all three reports, is now in front of Congress. In fact, I was on a call with the Senate staff yesterday. They wanted to know where it was. They already had it, but they hadn't gotten around to reading it yet. So our intention is to make it public as soon as we can.
So my next set of questions are, because you're in this position, it's transition, perhaps it's your upcoming year, your last year,
Yes, ma'am.
right? So general reflections on your experiences. So has your perspective on the role of the federal government in education research or education improvement shifted at all over your time in this role?
I should hope so.
So what's that?
Say more. So look, IAS is a great organization. It's 20 years old. We celebrate our 20th anniversary. We're in our 21st year. And I don't know how old your grandkids are. My grandkids are younger than that. But I remember when I was 21, I was totally crazy. Energy, questioning, etc. So 20-year-old federal agency is starting more like middle age, right? They're not crazy 20-year-olds. So it's a great organization, but it over 20 years, it's fallen into habits and structures and things like that. And I'm not a lazy person, and I'm not like a sleepy person. I have plenty of energy, less than I used to have. But the fact of the matter is, getting some of the things that I thought needed to be done turned out to be very difficult. And I mean, Liz is great, and Matt Soldner is here. He's the commissioner of NCE. So I've been blessed with a good senior leadership team. The project officers, I think you all dealt with them. They're really good. But at the end of 20 years, this is the way we do things, right? And you just ask questions like, why is that peer review intake form buried at the bottom of where you can't find it? And no one can answer it. That question in part because no one's ever asked that question before. Right. So we just ask a whole bunch of questions and, well, that's the way we do it. Well, that's not an acceptable answer. So I think from the day I showed up, I've been trying to ask these kinds of questions. Sometimes I get good answers, sometimes I don't. But I've been trying to modernize, change. So the old joke is, you could faster, cheaper, better, pick two. Well, yeah, that's not good enough. We want all three, but it's really hard.
What are you most proud of so far?
Sitting up here with you.
Go beyond that.
What am I most proud of? Wow. Every. No, I'm sorry. So people know me. I don't look back. I mean, I have 1 year, and all I'm concentrating on is what could I do in the next 11 months, 2 weeks. That's it. If you ask me what, so that's it's only somewhat flippant because it's really true. But I think it's not only my short-term memory is gone, my long-term memory is gone. So I can't even tell you what I did yesterday, let alone 5 years ago. I think the most important thing that we did, I think the most enduring contribution would be the SEER principles. And if you've ever tried to get money from us, you know what they are. But I think codifying those principles into, and then making them part of the application process, was really fundamentally important. And, the funny thing about it is like it happened by accident. We were talking, about like, what do we really want to happen? What do we want to structure the research endeavor? And Matt took a major role in codifying all this stuff, So I would say, what about this? What about that? And Matt like systematically started like, yeah, what about this? And what about that? And what about this? And what about that? And together, all of us, the Liz and Matt and I, created these principles. And I'm really proud of those. I think that really mattered. Fiona Hollins is sitting in the back. So she's the one that named them. We had a competition. To name them and SEER, Standards for Excellence in Education Research. She did it. And as a result, she's become a very good friend. And then we had another competition for NCAIDs. Actually, I keep using it, but I've been told not to use it because it presumes that Congress is going to create it. So then we started calling it Baby-Cade, Proto-Cade. Sounded like living in a cave someplace. I didn't like that one. Fiona came up with some, maybe other people in this audience did. And then ultimately, I'm like, I can't do this. So I just talked about NCAID.
What do you think are the unique affordances of IES in supporting the kinds of research that will have impact to practice? What are the constraints?
So one of the biggest mistakes, I can remember every once in a while. So one of the biggest mistakes I made was right at the beginning of my my tenure. I was very unhappy with the research to practice partnerships that were in existence. They had cost about $330 million, and this is 5 years ago. Many of them were run through the RELs, and they were, for my taste, they were way too process oriented and not enough outcome oriented. So I went into the den of lions, the NERP or whatever those letters are, and I said, like, there's a problem here. And the example I gave, which it still bothers me, is a quarter of those RPPs were focused on post-secondary success. So we know that the production to finish college, to get into the workforce, is time bound, right? You're in high school, you graduate high school, you enter college in using federal definitions 6 years later, you should be completed and you should have some workforce learning outcomes. Some of these RPPs focused on post-secondary education were way beyond that 6-year time. And I said, like, could any of these RPPs show me that they actually have improved post-secondary success? No. So for me, this was like, so again, in my younger, brasher days, I said, like, okay, so we spent $330 million. And what we do, we bought like better donuts and better coffee, right? But what's the outcome measure? So we've been struggling ever since to try to pivot to more outcome oriented, because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to move the needle. We're trying to improve student success. We're trying to improve learner outcomes across the lifespan. So trying to figure out how to reposition RPPs, we can't do our work without them. We cannot do our work without partnerships between researchers and state agencies and local agencies. So trying to pivot that to be much more intentionally focused on student outcomes and student learning is something that we've been working on. And I think that's really important. But people took my comments as like, you hate RPPs, you want to kill RPPs. And that was my fault, because I think I was not surprised, too blunt. But the fact of the matter is that we can't do the work without partnerships. But we have to rethink. And quite frankly, one of my disappointments in the NASM report was that I charged them with telling them what RPP V2 would look like, and there was not sufficient attention paid to that. So the next director could worry about that.
What do you see as some of the important cutting edge trends in education research?
Well, I think I'm right at the beginning, AI, massive data, broadening participation, and you know, I mean, I'm not I'm not an assessment guy, right? And but you know, we run NAEP, we do other kinds of testing, but I think straightening out our assessment system so that it reflects what we really need to know about what how kids are learning, where they are, you know, at a much more granular level than saying, you know, the Hispanic students in the state of New York are this. I mean, that's not useful today. So we need to figure this.
So my last question, and I think the discussion could link back to your last comments. I was on the NAEP Visionary and Development panel for Reading for 2026, and we had made um, some sets of recommendations about sort of expanding the kinds of information you needed for the findings to be useful and actionable. And so that for me relates to my last question here. In particular, what do you think are the implications of emergent convergent findings across disciplines about the science of human learning and development and research? And so the idea in here is that if we are interested in outcomes, and the outcomes we were talking about in terms of college completion and the like, that we've had a tendency to think about outcomes as one is purely cognitive, and that the processes for achieving whatever the goals, as again being primarily cognitive, without sufficient attention to things like uh, understanding the perceptions of stakeholders, whether it's students or teachers or district leaders, about um, human capacity, malleability in the face of challenge, about perceptions of relevance and safety and engaging in whatever the hard work that we may have around the kinds of um, supports and challenges in the ecologies, because it's not just, you know, all the systems that are at play, um, and that, and it's how all of these systemic, psychosocial, and relational processes work in dynamic relations with one another. It's very complex, and we don't really, I think, have sufficient supports for how to understand that. So I'm just curious. This may be a list question as well. For example, in the NAEP, one of the things we had recommended was, um, for example, expanding. We were told we couldn't do it anyway, but certainly the surveys, for example, that will ask questions about who lives in your home, which is not actionable because there's no system that can impact who's in the home. Uh, um, Inserting in the surveys questions about kids' perceptions of supports that are available to them, their sense of self-efficacy, the kinds of attachments they have. That would be inputs that are actually actionable. School systems could take these things up, particularly being available by NAEP. And we had also recommended that the recordings, which is reports, public reports, include disaggregation within race and ethnicity, because the scores as they are now would suggest, you know, Hispanic students are lower than white students or Black students are lower, when the variation within those groups sometimes associated by socioeconomic status, sort of disaggregating that kind of data. But all of these kinds of ideas, I think, are situated in this emerging sort of science of human learning and development, and the possibilities as well of kinds of collaborations between work going on in NSF and work going on in IES. So I'm just curious your thoughts, and again, Liz, you may have some as well about what does this suggest about sort of new directions, including the fact that we are observing convergences from learning sciences, from cultural psychology, social psychology, the various neurosciences, human development. These big ideas are emerging, but the people in those fields don't talk to them. They don't work together.
Okay. What's the question?
The question is, how do you think about? So I'm assuming that there will certainly be some conversations between you and whoever the new director may be in thinking about some of the challenges you've already talked about, with some of which are technical kinds of challenges, right? Staffing kinds of challenges. But there are also bigger conceptual challenges about sort of what are the new big challenges out there that IES is in a position to support.
So there, as you know, there are limits of what we can do. So if we start disaggregating the NAEP data, two things will happen. One is that we'll have small cells and we'll never be able to report anything. That's number one. And we already have problems. You know, in many states, reporting on Black or Hispanic students is almost impossible because the cell size is just too small. So to the extent to which we start disaggregating, then we are going to run up into even more places where we won't be able to report anything. That's number one.
Well, I think that's a technical statistical challenge which can be met, actually. We did discuss this.
Okay, so NAEP already is $195 million a year. And so the question is like, how much more do you want to spend on that? So that, I think that's a serious problem. The second, again, maybe a technical issue is that I think a lot of these questions, so not the psychological ones, but a lot of the kinds of environmental questions that you're talking about are best handled through administrative data, not through survey data. Right? There are certain things that can only be gotten through survey data, but surveys are expensive. Response rates are falling. Right? Surveys are always a problem these days. And so this is why my vision of SLDS V2 requires the integration of all these other data sources, so that in fact we can report on conditions for different communities, different subgroups, in much more detail than we'll ever be able to do a survey. But again, there's certain things that we cannot do with administrative data that only survey data could do. But if we get these wraparound views by integrating so much more of the existing data, and we make a commitment to reporting those data down to so that's actionable by school leaders, by community leaders, I think we could solve a lot of the problems that we're talking about.
So we have about, Liz, were you going to add?
Can I just jump in? Because Mark's talking about the national assessments, but I want to also, because we have a community of researchers and scholars here, there are opportunities within the measurement work that we're doing to really think carefully about how do we as a field develop measures that can be used. I'm super proud of the measurement work that we've done, and we've done a lot, like in the social and behavioral space, where we have a lot of the diagnostic kinds of things that Mark's been talking about available for everyone. But the ability to create these coherent and connected measurement systems is both a measurement challenge, but it's also a methodological challenge, right? And so we have our investment in stats and methods. And I think we're at a really, really interesting point where, if you will, sorry, I'm a developmental psychologist, we can instantiate Bronfenbrenner, right? How do we think about the ecosystem model that he put out, and think about that in terms of what are the individual kinds of measures that we need, and then how do we create network connections across those measures? And from a methodological standpoint, I think that's a big, big question. So I think there are opportunities for us as a field to put those applications in. I can only fund applications that come in, right? And so we need the community to really think about how do we create projects that help us answer that can then feed into work that that NAEP is doing and that the states are doing in terms of developing assessments.
So go ahead now.
So there's just one observation that I want to make before, and this is tangential, but it's fundamentally important. So the discussion about COVID and recovery from COVID has been overwhelmingly focused on learning loss. But one of the things that the School Pulse has revealed, and we all know this to be true, but the School Pulse has put real numbers on it, is the devastating consequences in terms of social and emotional health of American students that COVID had. And the numbers in the either the most recent or the one before it, School Pulse, were horrifying. Like 80, 90% of schools are reporting problems along social emotional behavior. Something like 20% of schools report that their teachers are afraid of their students, that their students are, of violence directed at them by students. I have 4 grandchildren, and I hear stories from my daughters about what goes on in schools in terms of just what normal behavior is rare now. So I think we paid a lot of attention to the cognitive losses and the learning losses, but the social behavioral losses and damage to our students from COVID were equally devastating.
As well as teachers. There's a teacher
And teachers,
burnout,
correct.
teachers being lost.
Yeah.
But this notion of thinking about holistic outcomes for the work that we do, I think is again situated very or warranted very much. There's emergent understanding that human learning and development is not isolated. Excuse me. And the possibility, it seems to me, that the methodological challenges that you're talking about, Liz, ultimately, and I think that was your point, connected to theoretical kinds of orientations and questions, what it might mean as you're thinking about, the supporting the transition into new leadership and the like. How do you create warrants to the Congress to understand that there needs to be a more expansive attention to a broader set of goals and so they'll give you some more money for the, expanding in the nature and the like. And what does it mean, I think, in terms of pushing the field forward, which is part of what I think is a fundamental task or goal for IES, of being able to, again, recruit communities of scholars through organizations to begin to collaborate to tackle these really complex and kinds of questions. So I would like to open it up. We've got about 10 minutes left for questions, comments that you'd like to make. There's a mic right there. I think they're recording this, or they probably want you on the mic.
I understand you're leaving this job, so it doesn't make any sense to give you some good ideas. So
No, he'll pass them on.
Okay.
We're recording.
Okay. One of the things that
Could you introduce yourself, please?
my name is Seth Chaiklin, and I work in Denmark. And behind my question is there's a lot of research about how research affects practice, and what struck me in the whole presentation today was that none of that knowledge was woven into the conversations that we were having. And so just to select one among many issues that could be pulled out from that perspective is that we know that systemic change is really a necessary process. And systemic change means you have to have support networks at the individual school levels. You have to have coordination. I mean, you know all these things, so I don't need to rehearse them for you. But then when you talk about this kind of ARPA, rapid change, high impacts, scaling up, it flies in the face of everything that we know. And I'm not trying to scold you about it. I'm always curious about why we're not using the knowledge that we have about how research intervenes in practice to sort of get an alignment so that the kinds of support I realize that politicians are looking for simple solutions or things that, well, I think I've sort of introduced a theme, and I'll just stop. And curious whether that stimulates some reflections.
It stimulated reflection. Thank you. So the thing that we have money, and not a lot of money, but we do have money. But the work is not our work. The work is the field work, right? We as Liz said, we could only support applications, research that comes through our door, right? And I'm not sure if you're saying that we are, that we have systematic. Yeah, don't go away. You stand up there too, or you can sit at one of the edge chairs there.
Okay, but so then one of the ideas I always think about the Human Genome Project, where people agree on a bigger goal that they're moving toward, where each individual researcher isn't able to do that, and so even though you sort of pass the buck back to the field, but you guys are structuring or you're signaling the kinds of things that people should be interested in. You also can have an infrastructure function. One of the things I wrote a paper once where what always struck me about curriculum development is you need to think from the content what the goals are to what content is needed, what teachers need to be able to master in order to work with that content, to what kind of institutional structure will even allow teachers. What if researchers agreed on that basic model? You can then have all kinds of differences of opinion about goals and content and how to structure. But the point is, there's a kind of common framework. And this is a place where physicists have an advantage because they share the general frame that they're working in, but then they have really big differences in how they work in relation to the frame. This is a place where a funding agency could maybe invite researchers together to try to work out, can we really find, because in the effective, why effective was ineffective, what struck me, that conversation was occurring at 3 or 4 different levels, and no one was able to reflect on the fact of how to understand the structure of what it is that they're talking about. And this is a place where I could, and if I was sitting in your chair, this is what I would be trying to do, to think about what we can do to support the researchers to gain advantage from the knowledge that's already been developed about both how school systems develop and also how research affects practice. Because to keep reproducing this idea that we're going to find one quick change, it's just, we know this is a false model. And I just think it's really unfortunate. I mean, on the one hand, you say it's not a lot of money, but it's a lot of money. And it's unfortunate it's just being wasted in a sense.
Well, this chair will be empty next year. So,
But if I could just add, I think that one that IES has had historically, if I'm understanding you correctly, sort of field building initiatives. So I'm thinking about the Reading for Understanding initiative, where the IES had a conception of a broader kind of goal,
Yeah.
and recruit, and the money incentive was to bring people together. When we did that, we were meeting, all the groups were meeting, several times a year. But I also think that the point you're making, which I think is absolutely essential, is complicated in the United States because education exists at the local level.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's it. Well,
okay, so Matt,
Hey, Matt Solden, Commissioner NCE. So it's never good to get in a debate in this kind of setting, but I guess I would reject a bit the premise of your argument that we are deeply committed to helping policymakers and educators use research evidence. Not to call out my colleague Nicole Patentary, but the regional education labs, at least prior to my tenure, certainly not the whole life, but some of the past decade or so, has been deeply committed to figuring out ways to bring the expertise of the education sciences down to the state and local level. And so our 10 RELs across the country work in partnerships with FCAs and LEAs every single day, trying to get evidence-based practices instantiated in classrooms, in districts, in state, and policymakers at the state level. So I think we do a lot of that. We also do, through NCER, research on the use of research evidence, trying to push the field, understanding how we can do that better. We have some language in the president's budget, if the Congress is so inclined to fund it, to use the REL program to test better even more of that work. So I think use of research evidence and getting evidence-based practices into the water with direct technical assistance on the ground is something that's baked into the DNA of IAS. So I feel like we're on the right track with that. Maybe we aren't everywhere where you might want us to be, but I think that's a substantial commitment of IAS.
Yeah.
Since he said my name. But I do think, and I think it's an interesting comment you brought up the Human Genome Project, because I think that's a good example, because we have had big meetings about this and what is the parallel here. And I think that when you look at the work of the Human Genome Project and you talk to those individuals who've done this work and finally mapped this genome, which is like very recent, right? That really recently just happened. And one of their primary challenges, nobody uses it. So they spent a huge amount of investment, huge amount of time bringing people together. Nobody uses it. I think, and that's not unlike what is the challenge for IES or many other federal agencies for that matter, or even us as researchers in university-based or academic research-based settings. There's a lot of good things that we do and we know and we understand, but getting that to be actualized out in the world is a real challenge. And so my question, I guess, there's something to reflect on in this conversation. Is the goal to be fast or is the goal to be responsive? It's not, I agree with you. The urgency with which I feel around the work that I do, that I run a center with reading in its name, and I can walk to schools from my front door who are amongst the worst performing schools in my backyard. I can't stand it. So the urgency is real for me, right? And very personal for me because these kids are my kids. They're me, right? So it's a very personal thing. But the change that's required when you do technical assistance on the ground to actually to see the outcome you want to see, like graduation rates or third grade reading scores, or the things by which we can measure, because that's what becomes important, what you can measure. Those things happen over time. So, and it happens over time if we figure out ways to be responsive in the context in which people are living and learning and growing and developing. So I wonder, all of your suggestions and things that you're focused on, I get it. I see it. I even see how we can engage in it. Like I got a plan already about what I'm going to do about this. But I also think there's part of this, you move slow to go fast. And so I wonder, in this switch, in this move, in this change, is the goal to be fast or is the goal to be responsive?
So look, I mean, clearly the goal is both, right? The fast part is that we don't want to spend 5 years, right, working on something that after several months we know has no future, that it's not working.
Yeah.
So the part of fast is fail fast, right, and stop doing things that don't work. And we don't want to. So sometimes I think about what happened with the COVID vaccine, and I don't care if I'm still loaded with 5 shots and all this stuff. So I'm not an anti-vax person, so by no means. And there are questions about, obviously serious questions about the science and how good it is. That's not the point. The point is that what we did was we built a infrastructure, right? And then when we needed a vaccine, we were able to create the vaccine in 10 months instead of 10 years. But how did we do it? We ended up with advanced purchases so that companies were willing to gamble on this. We supported multiple vaccine companies trying to do the same thing at the same time with different approaches. And we ended up saving God knows how many lives, right? I mean, I believe we did. Obviously, anti-vaxxers don't believe that, but I believe we saved a lot of lives. But that was based on an infrastructure that we could then pop things on top of. The same thing with ChatGPT. Who even knew that this was going to pop up? But the fact of the matter is that we've been working on AI and large language models and all this stuff for a long time. And all of a sudden, boom, ChatGPT comes in. Our world has changed. So for me, the question is, can we in NK, in NCR, what kind of baseline can we develop on strong science, on strong evidence, so that we can pop things on top of it, so we don't have to wait 5 years, 10 years for a new vaccine or the equivalent to pop up. That's my image. That's what I want to do. But I don't want to spend 5 years and $5 million and then at the end say, oh, look at that, it didn't work, right? I mean, so the going back to the COVID thing, what would have happened in our model, right? Our traditional business model. Hey, let's try this math intervention. 5 years, it didn't work. Oh, let's try another math intervention. 5 years later, it didn't work, right? And then, then all your kids are are my age and they haven't learned math. We can't do it that way. So we need a different conceptualization of how we want to do, multiple trials, multiple arm trials. But we have to be able to do that, and we have to stop doing things that don't work. And most things don't work, by the way. We know that. But the few things that do work, we have to replicate them. We have to drill down to the populations to find the populations that they work. So our fixation on main effects, which was crazy, by the time we got around to it was better than nothing. But by the time we started doing main effects, individualized medicine has said that no, main effects doesn't matter. It's wrong. But we were fixated on main effects. The fact of the matter is we have to do like contingents. We have to figure out like what populations does it work for? What are the relevant populations? And we have to do it faster, and we have to do it, and we have to just stop doing things that don't work.
So I'm just going to give a closing comment because we're actually over time now. And that is that I think that the issue of impact, efficacy of impact, is rooted in the conceptualization of the problem. And the conceptualization of the problem from a systems perspective is the fact that we have the leverage of the federal government, we have the leverage of the state government, we have the leverage of individual districts. And if we look at what's happening across the country right now, with different states taking on diametrically different positions around some fundamental kinds of questions, learning what does it mean to be able to get those in collaborations. One of the underlying sort of scientific propositions, if you will, I think, that underlie the ability, and in addition to the systems that you have for, the competition to get better vaccines, was that there was an underlying scientific proposition. I don't remember what it is, the term for it, right? That had been going on for decades. That they were, am I right? That they were not sort of starting from scratch and everybody making up whatever they wanted. And what I think we lack, and this isn't an IES question, this is a broad question across the board, and this is where I come back to my science of human learning development. That's not a new mantra, is to have a sufficiently nuanced and complex conception of the problem that we're dealing with in order to have impact that can not take forever, to do. So with that,
I'm sorry, I just want to add one final thing to that. So we, and Liz has been instrumental in this, you mentioned reading for understanding. So IS has spent over $100 million on the science of reading. And, NIH has, NSF has, we have brain scans, we have everything, the best science ever with regard to reading. And we still have reading wars.
But this again goes back to the problem, but we could be here forever getting the reading thing. And that is the contestations around the fundamental processes of human learning and development as they're getting taken up. There is no venue or forum to deal with the counter evidence. So one group says, have their set of principles, another group has another set of principles, and you've got research on both sides, each of which has some level of flaw, and there's no structure for vetting it. And what I think is that the pieces that get taken up are taken up by political interest and not by science. But anyway, that's my thing. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Mike.